If you bring the right stakeholders into the room around the comp philosophy, you start to get buy-in from the outset.
Welcome back to the TroopHR Podcast. I'm your host, Taylor Bradley. In today's episode, I get to sit down with OpenComp CEO Bobby Benfield. We get to discuss something that there are generally not a lot of hot takes on or strong opinions, and that is compensation. Of course, we know as HR leaders that there's a range of opinions and challenges and opportunities that we can do to evolve the compensation process and philosophies in our organization. And I walk through the episode today with Bobby on how OpenComp has helped enable my organization to do that, but also could help yours. There are some hot takes and practical insights ahead, and we always start at the ground floor by asking Bobby, what role does compensation play in attracting and retaining talent in an organization?
I see it playing a bigger and bigger role over time. I think we're really in the early stages of transforming what compensation can be inside companies. For many, many years, it was really, I think, not thought of strategically, not thought of analytically for a variety of reasons, which we'll probably get into. And now I think that people have access to compensation data and tools and analytics capabilities around how to use compensation as a tool to build goodwill with top performers and how to help develop talent. It's just going to become more and more of a strategic tool for really having top organizational management within companies.
And it seems like historically, folks have thought of compensation as just the bands. Just tell me what the bands are. How have you been seeing that tangibly evolve over the past few years?
The bands still play a role because that's the foundation. Compensation is dynamic. The market changes. There's obviously a relationship with skill and the talent market that you're in. If you take AI, for example, right now where there's just a huge war for talent, the bands quickly are out of date. There are a lot of other things that go on outside the bands that influence retention and attrition, time in role, number of increases, amount of increases, things like that. And then, of course, there's pay equity and the like. So the bands are really just the starting point. They're the foundation. They're the architecture. But in terms of really using compensation as an effective tool to build goodwill and trust with your employees, the bands set the foundation, but everything else happens in and around the bands.
I like that you brought up trust because I do see that as a core element of the foundation that you've been describing. When leveraging tools like OpenComp, for example, how does that empower the leadership to build trust with the talents when they're using these types of tools like yours?
Great question. It starts even before using the tool, and we actually help companies with this as well. It starts by building a really strong pay philosophy, which is, like the compass, and then the strategy is the map. And so if you have a pay philosophy that talks about how you reward talent with pay and is well understood by the employee base, then the expectation is set. And then I think if you deliver against expectations, that's how you build trust. What happens so often today is people don't know what the expectations are, or then if they do know what the expectations are, so often the pay doesn't really align with the expectations. You might have somebody in a company that is a top performer by performance score, but then when it comes down to giving a pay increase, the pay increase won't be commensurate with the performance. And sometimes it won't even be commensurate with the range. And so obviously that right there is a breach of trust, especially if in a company that has a well-established, well-communicated pay philosophy that says something like we pay top performers ahead of the market, and then that doesn't happen and people don't understand why, immediately trust is broken. I always view compensation as a sacred contract between employee and employer. And still, so often today, anytime you have a compensation conversation, the elephant's in the room. The manager often feels, maybe not well equipped to handle questions. The employee doesn't really understand. And that leads to a breach of trust between manager and senior manager and between employee and manager in the conversation. And so there's just a lot of opportunity to address that. And by contrast, if you do that right, you can really build trust. Even if you're communicating a hard message, I find that surprises are worse if somebody is not getting paid what she or he wants, but understands why and what the path is to get paid, and it's consistent with performance expectations and development areas that have been communicated throughout the years, then I think you find that person might be upset, but they'd think that this person is trying to help me get better. It's a much better situation to deal with than the other one.
When I hear the distrust part of it too, I completely agree, is that folks not having the transparency or the understanding of the why can cause much more consternation than the what that necessarily happened. Another hot take from me, and I'll save you from the hot take here, is it's really frustrating when you have, going back to your example, you're a high performer, and let's say you promote them, but then there's this apprehension or this friction in the process of, no, we can't give them this large increase to get them into the market rate for the next role, because that's just not how the budget works, or some kind of constraint that way. And my slogan is, I always want to pay people for the job they're going to do and not the job they had. That person's market rate, that value that they can generate, they can go get that in the market. So if we're not able to do that for them, you're setting yourself up to potentially break down trust, but also lose that institutional knowledge or lose that value that a person's generating from your organization. And because I've used you all and you've helped us form a comp philosophy at my existing organization, what are some of the pitfalls when you're working with HR leaders or executives on creating the foundation, that compensation philosophy? What are the pitfalls you see that are common?
One of the pitfalls is that it may not be with the people ops or HR leader. We have to understand so often how the company is orged and how finance is involved and how much finance is part of the process. Because in a lot of cases, we'll be talking to companies where the people ops or HR leader is our champion, but finance doesn't necessarily understand why. So first of all, I'd say that's one pitfall, not having organizational alignment. I kind of go back to the comp philosophy again, like writing a corporate mission statement. If you bring the right stakeholders into the room around the comp philosophy, you start to get buy-in from the outset because you get input from all the various stakeholders. Finance might be much more budget sensitive or numbers oriented and really want some hard data to justify big increases or position on range, or like you said, if finance realizes there might be a major talent drain, especially in an area where the company has a strategic focus in the upcoming year, because the people are underpaid, then finance might be on the line for that. So starting that conversation early with all the stakeholders in it at the strategy level, and then continuing that dialogue now, once you have your pay philosophy, actually translating that to ranges, strategic ranges, so that, for example, if in certain roles you want to index higher than the market because you don't want to have an attrition problem, and in other roles you can be at 50%, you have that conversation that then actually translates to the strategy itself, that then translates to the numbers, that then cascades throughout the organization down to managers as well. So managers are equipped to have that conversation to say, hey, for these roles, we pay at 50% to the market. And that that's pretty much in line with the market. So you're less likely to have a talent drain there. And then if you're in a talent market that is more liquid and competitive at the time and you're paying a premium to the role, that's communicated, it's understood. If now performance factors into it and you have already communicated that top performers are going to index higher on the range, that avoids the pitfalls. So it's really trying to start from the outset and have a consistent narrative throughout execution with all of the stakeholders and the execution partners involved and aligned and well prepared. I think if you do that, then you're much less likely to have the type of situation that you described. But what so often happens is pay is a little swept to the side. People start hiring, they've got hiring goals. You end up with a scatter plot of pay all over the map and no rhyme or reason. And then you'll get a professional that will come in and say, we've got to clean this up. And then that's a big effort to clean it up. I also talk about building a house. If you know how you're going to build the house in the beginning and you build the foundation the right way and you make the right choices along the way, consistent with your plan, you're going to avoid pitfalls. It's the same thing with compensation, but so often that doesn't happen still today within companies.
That was what your organization was really influential when we were building out our compensation philosophy as well, and supporting us, was creating that one where all the stakeholders were involved at the onset. And for the listeners, that's such a critical aspect because you can eliminate so much friction in your system and awkward conversations or difficult conversations by having something that everyone has bought into and then be very transparent on. We've been very open on our comp philosophy and how we go about calculating things of that nature so that any employee can go look that up so that there's no mystery around it. Because what I'd found, Bobby, in my experience is people don't fill in information gaps positively. No one ever goes, I don't know what's going on, but I bet it's great, right? At best, you may get a neutral, but more common, you get that filled in with negativity. Now, another journey that I've been on in my career is I've worked at many startups. And every time I arrive, when we talk about what's the comp philosophy, what structures we have in place, I'm usually presented with spreadsheets, maybe some existing process, maybe some documented process. But how do you all help organizations get past that to something that scales more rapidly?
Happy to answer that. I want to go back of a really astute observation that you made and then get into why software over spreadsheets. But if you don't write the narrative or write the philosophy, your employees will do it for you and it will be negative. So instead, you've got to take control of the narrative and then execute it. I think spreadsheets are kind of a function of the way comp data was provisioned to the market for so long. Just, only the most well-resourced businesses could afford it. Takes a lot of time to kind of work with it. And then the ability to kind of have a system that actually has data, that's actual comp data that you can then work with within software instead of spreadsheets just didn't exist until a few years ago. Some people will still use their spreadsheets for the really deep analysis. And I do that on some platforms. I use whether or not it's comp, where my day-to-day analytics and reporting will be all through the platform. And then when I want to go deep, I get comfortable in my spreadsheets. But today, we provide the tools for everybody to do it in the software. So, you have your data, which is your actual comp data. You have your benchmark. You have your ranges. And from there, you can do everything you want to do. You can run analytics to make comparisons by any number of metrics, whether that's tenure, time in role, position on range, performance, gender. You can cut the data so you can actually see and get some insights from your data. Your ranges are housed on our platform. So, when you want to go back and update your ranges, it's not, okay, I need to kind of download them, spend, weeks working in spreadsheets and then re-upload them. You can do that right there in the tool. When you want to communicate offers, you've got your benchmarks, you've got your ranges right there. You can basically decide how you want to price the offer using the data that you have. One of the most active parts of our platform is our merit cycle suite, where people run, their full merit cycles in our product rather than using spreadsheets. And it's just a much better way for them to configure their cycle and then to work with managers and budget owners to then implement the cycle and then communicate to employees what their ranges are going to be. And the good thing is you're not starting from scratch each year. It's there and you're not having to pull in new data because the data just updates. Instead of spending time procuring data, building spreadsheets, working in spreadsheets, people can actually spend time working with the data.
What you'd mentioned was music to my ears and made it easy for us as having that all-in-one suite of your comp data is here, but also your merit cycle. Maybe my listeners have never heard of this before, but when you do spreadsheet merit cycles, you end up with an inbox of a CVS file that says final, 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 no, use this one, no, this one. And then there's just kind of calamity in that process. So having it in the system was hugely helpful. And we've covered a couple milestones here. We built out a philosophy. We've worked with some HR leaders to iron out these processes. What guidance would you have for helping to train managers and bring managers along? Because that's where the rubber meets the road.
If the first parts are done right, then I think training managers is easy because there's always a reference point for the questions. If you have a philosophy and then you have a strategy, as in your bands that are consistent with the philosophy, and you've communicated that to the company as a whole, then any question that the manager gets can refer back to that strategy and that philosophy. You have fewer exceptions. And if there are exceptions, they're well understood. Your strategy should account for that. As I kind of mentioned before, whatever percentage you pay relative to market with a multiplier perhaps for performance, then as long as those two things are aligned, the manager's conversation will be already handled. I think things get a little bit harder sometimes on equity, just depending upon the stage of the business. There's some more technical terminology. There, I think it's just education. The universe of questions is actually pretty finite when you boil it down. And so I think by having a very consistent narrative, as we've been talking about, and for some of the more technical areas like equity, just making sure that people understand how to address more technical questions about dilution and things like that. When I first came into this role and I talked to a lot of comp leaders out there, they said one of the number one emotions they feel is fear about sending the manager into that room. If you've equipped the manager, with a house that has a strong foundation and anticipated the types of questions you're going to get, then I think you don't have to have that fear.
And training the managers is the most critical aspect, because all of what we've discussed so far in the foundation, the philosophy, if the managers aren't prepared, to your point, to have that conversation. And HRBP teams that I lead, we offer role play services. We do the trainings. We have a generative AI interactive voice session where leaders can practice these types of difficult conversations, because it isn't a conversation they have often, right? At most, maybe once a year. And very rarely do they have to go into a lot of detail. So that is a skill that we are very proactive with building out. Now, that said, we have gotten to the payroll cycle. How does technology like yours help enforce or build trust with the organization? What are some unique aspects of the platform that help do that?
I think it's everything we've really talked about. By virtue of having a platform that has the data there, that has the tooling, so that you don't need to spend time doing that every year, it gives you the time to do what we've talked about, which is to have a house that's in order, have a philosophy that's consistent with the strategy. The only thing that changes each year is the market, but the concepts stay the same. And of course, you have new people become managers. And so there's just a talent management exercise, I think, that happens, whereas some managers will be more fluent than others in handling those types of situations. You need some feedback loops as far as that's concerned. But I think our platform enables people to spend, no time pulling together the things that you need to have the insights to make those conversations well, and all the time to give you the insights that you can then translate into those conversations so that people are prepared. Where I think we're headed, and I'd like to see us headed, is that it isn't that one loaded conversation. It's a continuous narrative in a company where from the outset, people understand that businesses, teams, whether you're in sports, whether you're in business, top performance should be rewarded, because you want to keep the top performer there and not going to your competitor. If you do it right, you don't have the big conversation, because people always know where they stand. They know that the pay is going to be consistent with where they stand. And you can't do that without software, because you spend, so much time just getting your hands on the data, doing your analytics. It doesn't leave you any time to do the rest of it. And so, by having that strong, stable foundation that lives inside a software platform that everybody has access to, that allows you to have a consistent narrative, that's the way you operate as a business, it's an ongoing continuum. There isn't one loaded conversation. Sure, things can come around. Somebody that wants a promotion and deserves a promotion, that's a different animal, but still people would understand what they get paid for that promotion. But as far as pay and pay practices and how they're tied to performance, if done right, and that can only be done when you're using a software platform like ours, it's just a ongoing narrative that's part of the way the company operates, and it does help build trust.
In the annual pay cycle, or the comp philosophy becomes perennial versus a once a year thing. And I love that approach and that evolution that you're encouraging all of us to do as HR leaders. Now, as we come in here for a landing, two final questions for you. One is, since your time leading at OpenComp, what is something that you now know that you wish you would have known on day one when taking the role?
There are a lot of things that come to mind, but I think really tying the different stakeholders together and addressing each of their needs and allowing them to speak the same language. I've really learned a lot in my journey here, and it's something we're thinking about how to do inside the product, because whether you're in finance, whether you're in people not ops, whether or not you're manager, you have your purview, your charter. In the end, you should all be aligned, but you have different tools and different skills. And so finding a way to harmonize those skills and get all people aligned through the use of the product, that's something that, I think I've really learned a lot during my time at OpenComp and really thought about how to bring that to life inside our product.
I love the common language. It's something that I've had to chat with business partners and things over the years is managers don't necessarily want to know the definition of a comp ratio. They want to know what they're doing is setting them up for success to retain their talent on their team. And finding that common ground of this is empowering that is an important connection to make. Now, the final question I have for you, hopefully the easiest. If folks want, like my organization, to connect with you and utilize your services and find out more, what is the best way to do that?
They can email me directly at bobby@opencomp.com. I'm happy to talk to anybody. Can I say one quick thing, even though we're here at Landing? Because you just brought up another thing that's been a pet peeve that I actually knew about before I got into this market. But terms like comp ratio and scientific terms as compared to the human effect of the ratio, the policy, that's something that needs to change inside compensation, because, people aren't widgets. They're not comp ratios. They're employees that are getting paid, that want to get paid and want to do a job. And so I just think there's been this complexity that's been built up. There's this almost culture around it trying to preserve that status quo. And I think in the end, it attenuates the link between the pay and the human. So you teed that up for me and I had to go there.
Couldn't agree more. So it's a perfect way to bring us in for a landing. Bobby, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the TroopHR Podcast. If you've liked this episode, we would encourage you to like and subscribe. If you would like to learn more about the TroopHR community, you can reach out to TroopHR.com. In the meantime, keep living the dream.